Thank you so much, Barry, for this introduction. Well, I'm afraid in this talk today, I won't talk too much about the mind. It will be more about kind of the physical occurrences in the world, but hopefully it will be fun anyway. So the title of my talk promises medieval murder mysteries, but this may have been a slight misdirection on my part for reasons that I'm about to explain. But don't be alarmed, there will still be a lot of mysteries along the way. So first of all, the concept of murder mystery belongs firmly to the sphere of literature. Although we can call real-life unsolved murder cases murder mysteries, the term itself is spring-loaded with certain expectations. Though it may be a mystery, we still yearn for it to be solved by a plucky, charismatic detective. My fellow crime fiction enjoyers will be familiar with the basic story structure of a murder mystery. So the murder itself usually occurs behind the scenes before the book starts, and the characters, as well as the reader, are then presented with some initial facts, and that's where the real story begins, the story of the investigation. It is usually designed in such a way that the reader is able to work alongside the detective, interpreting the clues as they arise, and readers who are especially adept or well-versed in the genre conventions may even beat the detective to the punch and solve the puzzle before all is revealed at the end of the book. And once the killer is unmasked and the mystery is no more, the story concludes. So this is the classic formula of a whodunit, found in many of, for example, Agatha Christie's or Arthur Conan Doyle's works. And there are, of course, other subgenres of crime fiction and crime cinema, which have different narrative conventions, such as hard-boiled fiction and noir, legal thriller, suspense thriller, courtroom drama, and so on. And the expectations of a tidily resolved murder mystery have also seeped into the real life with the unprecedented popularity of true crime as a genre of entertainment. But what you'll notice is that these types of stories, whether imagined or real, don't really go back much earlier than the 19th century. And they certainly didn't exist in medieval literature or in medieval worldview in general, at least not in the way that we are used to. And there weren't really any medieval murder mysteries because people didn't treat stories or accounts of crime as puzzles to be solved. And when murder was described, its circumstances were usually presented in a direct and blunt manner without obscuring any part of it for a dazzling revelation later down the line. So I will illustrate what I mean with an example from medieval Irish literature to get us a bit closer to the topic. So let's consider the Middle Irish tale about a monster hero, Roy MacDare, who got entangled in the exploits of the famous Cuchulainn, the greatest hero of Ulster. So imagine for a second that this story is a detective novel. So in that case, it would start with a description of 3 deaths. So first, around the time of Samhain, Halloween, Roy himself was killed under strange circumstances. He was found dead in the bath with his hair tied to a railing. And then a while later, there was a suspicious murder homicide. Roy's former poet, Ferchardne, threw himself off a cliff, and with him, he took Roy's wife, Blathnit. So these deaths are clearly somehow related, but no one knows exactly what happened. So this is where a medieval Irish detective, a la Sherlock Holmes, would step in and get to work investigating the case. He would establish, for example, that Cuchulainn had a previous grudge against Roy because Roy humiliated him on a previous occasion, and so Cuchulainn wanted revenge. Then it would also be revealed that before he died, the poet Ferchardne witnessed a scandalous rendezvous between Cuchulainn and Blathnit, the dead man's wife. And then after dozens of pages of new clues, dark secrets, and clever misdirections, the story of the murders would finally be uncovered. And what our hypothetical Irish Sherlock Holmes would reveal to us, to our astonishment and delight, would be exactly what the medieval tale itself is, a concise, linear account of the events, only a few pages in length, without any pretense of mystery. And so that's what the real story is. So I will summarize it for you. Not only did Cuchulainn have a gripe with Roy, but he also had an affair with his wife. And so together, the two of them orchestrated the trap for the clueless husband. And Blathnut invited Cuchulainn into the fort when Curoi was bathing and thus was at his most vulnerable. She tied his hair around the railing because this was the only way that Cuchulainn could get an upper hand on his superior opponent. So then Cuchulainn killed Curoi, and together with Blathnut, the two of them returned to the court of King Conchobar. But little did they know that the whole event was witnessed by Curoi's faithful poet, Ferhyrne, who followed the two lovers looking to avenge his lord. And then he saw Blathnut standing dangerously at the edge of a cliff, so he lunged at her, hurling both of them down towards their death. And unfortunately for Blathnut, she was not able to pull off Sherlock Holmes's own famous trick at the Reichenbach Falls and survive the cliffside struggle. So she died, and Cuchulainn went on living until he was slain by Curoi's son, Luhit, in revenge for his father, in a different tale. So in my creative reimagining of the story, in my creative reimagining, I kind of rearranged the order of events to resemble the structure of a murder mystery. But that's not at all how medieval stories work. Personally, I find it quite interesting how little interest there is in medieval sources to create this kind of excitement in the narrative through an interplay between concealment and disclosure. One of the reasons why such ideas could not arise in pre-modern times is because the real-life methods of homicide investigation were very different from those that started to emerge in the modern period, and which also eventually inspired the image of an ever-perceptive and resourceful detective, or more recently, maybe a tenacious FBI agent or a noisy journalist. So earlier, I asked you to imagine a Sherlock Holmes-type detective helming an investigation of medieval murders. And I hope that it was a fun mental exercise, but it is, of course, a gross anachronism. And I will talk about the actual realities of medieval investigative procedures in a moment, but if anyone here does enjoy this idea of a medieval Sherlock Holmes and would love to learn about how such a character would use his deductive skills to find a serial killer at work in an Italian monastery in the 1320s, then I recommend to you this book here, Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. So like I said, although there may not have been any murder mysteries in the true sense of the word in the Middle Ages, there were certainly more than enough murders, and some of them were quite mysterious. So in this part of the talk, I will outline what medieval Irish law says about homicide, its types, and ways to find and prosecute the culprit. So for context, by medieval or early Irish law, I refer to the corpus of legal texts written in Ireland between the 7th and the 16th century. So that's almost 1,000 years of continuity in legal practice. But the Irish legal system wasn't entirely fossilized at this time either, and certain innovations took hold as the world around it changed. And of course, a huge factor in this change was the English invasion. Between the establishment of the Lordship of Ireland in the late 12th century and the fall of the Gaelic order in the mid-17th century, Irish law continued to be practiced in the parts of the island still controlled by Irish rulers, but the areas of the Lordship were under the jurisdiction of the English common law, and the two legal systems could not help but interact with each other. So, like in pretty much any legal system, in Irish law, homicide was considered one of the most serious offenses. From an early date, Irish jurists distinguished between intentional homicide, that is murder, and different varieties of unintentional homicide, which we now know as manslaughter. So the punishment for premeditated murder was not physical, but monetary. A person convicted of murder had to pay 2 fines to the victim's kinsmen. One of them is the fixed fine for murder, which equals to 21 cows or 21 ounces of silver, and the other is honor price, the value of which depends on the status of the recipients. So in this case, the deceased person's kin. And if the victim happened to belong to a noble family, the fines could become quite astronomical. And then there was another, even more serious category of homicide, secret murder. The Irish term for it is whodunnit, literally man-stealth. It is murder accompanied by concealment, whereby the body of the victim is purposefully hidden. This is different from regular murder, which usually would have maybe a few witnesses and also leave behind a body. So, since the identity of the culprit could be ascertained by those witnesses, these cases didn't really need much solving, and it was easier for the victim's kin to exact penalties from the killer. They could also bury the body, as was required by the Christian custom. But secret murder, with its covert nature and the missing body, complicated both of those tasks. This is why it was considered a particularly gruesome offense and was punished with double the penalty of non-secret murder. So now you may be wondering, how would one go about investigating such a case? If we quickly have a look at what's happening over in England in the 12th and 13th century, we will find that felonies such as homicide or theft were considered not only offenses against an individual, but against the crown and the king. And this is why state officials gained a central role in investigating and prosecuting such cases, and a number of administrative positions emerged to service this government machinery, such as the constable, the bailiff, the sheriff, and the coroner, some of which we still have today. So their duties included, but were not limited to, participation in criminal proceedings. But in comparison, in Ireland, the role of the king and his officials in such matters was much less defined. We know that local kings presided over court hearings, but they didn't really seem to have maintained administrative personnel specifically for the purpose of law enforcement. Instead, the task of reporting offenses and initiating legal procedures was entirely in the hands of private individuals. A victim or the relatives of the victim could bring an action against the person whom they thought to be the offender, so they would bring it to court. Then both the plaintiff and the defendant would lawyer up by hiring advocates to represent them in court. So the most substantial part of the legal process was the stage of pleading and counter-pleading, in which the advocates of both parties first presented their own cases and then responded to the opponent's case. This is where each party had the opportunity to communicate their version of events supported by appropriate evidence. And then based on this, the judges would make their decision and pronounce the verdict. This was the process for all lawsuits, not only those involving homicide. So let's dwell for a bit on the question of evidence and proof. We are talking about a period of time here well before forensic science was formalized. So in the absence of such tools as fingerprint technology and toxicology reports, the types of proof available to medieval Irish courts were very limited. So the most secure type of evidence was an eyewitness account. It was by far the most desirable type of proof, to the point where any evidence obtained through means other than eyewitness testimony was considered an estimation made on the basis of opinion. Eyewitness evidence was the most useful in civil cases, such as contract disputes, but in situations involving more serious offenses, the line between a witness and a culpable onlooker was dangerously thin. Anyone who witnessed a murder was obliged to intervene or report it immediately, and failure to do so would make such person an accessory. But of course, not every offense had eyewitnesses. This is why for the cases of theft, which is covert by definition, an entire system of indirect evidence was developed. And the most damning piece of evidence was to be found in possession of the stolen goods, of course, or if you were a cattle thief, having cattle tracks leading to your house. So those things were pretty hard to deny. But even more trivial factors could be taken into consideration, such as various unusual behaviors. For example, excessive blushing could be taken as an indicator of a burdened conscience. And if someone slept in late one morning, it could mean that they were up to no good the night before. So this is a pretty fascinating glimpse into the world of detective work that took place in medieval Ireland. But what about those cases where evidence simply could not be obtained, such as secret murder? In this case, the advocates could choose a special path of judgment which allowed some kind of emergency procedures, so to say. It was called fear, truth, and it is described in the text called 5 Paths of Judgment. So the text recommends 2 procedures for establishing fear or the truth of the case. Both of them fell on the defendant, who obviously would want to prove their innocence. The first is a formal oath of denial. Oaths had great legal power in the Middle Ages because they were sworn by evoking God or something sacred, and therefore were understood to be absolutely true statements, and perjury was heavily punished. But the oath of denial could not be sworn by the defendant himself. Instead, he had to bring a set number of people who would confirm under oath that he is innocent. These oath swearers couldn't just be anyone, they had to be people of good legal standing. And the number of oath swearers depended on the type of offense committed and on the status of the defendant, and it could go up as high as 60 people, and that's how many were required in cases of secret murder when the defendant was a person of low social standing. These people were not eyewitnesses and could testify only as to whether or not they thought the defendant was capable of doing the thing that he was accused of. So today we would describe such people as character witnesses. So while those people were taking their oath, the defendant himself underwent a different sort of trial. It was called firde, divine proof, or put simply, an ordeal. Ordeals were a popular type of proof in the early Middle Ages, especially for solving cases with no other available evidence. One Irish legal text ascribes the introduction of ordeals to Ireland to St. Patrick himself. An ordeal is a physical challenge, the outcome of which determines the suspect's guilt or innocence. So, for example, a defendant could be made to hold a hot iron or retrieve something from the bottom of a cauldron of boiling water, and their hand would then be bandaged and left untouched, and after several days, the bandages would be removed and the injury assessed. If it miraculously healed, it meant that God himself affirmed the suspect's innocence. Otherwise, a guilty verdict was guaranteed. A special type of ordeal was a judicial duel, which was used, for example, again in cases of secret murder. It was a highly regulated encounter between two combatants, representing prosecution and defense. And if the defendant prevailed, it was not through his fighting prowess, but due to the divine justice affirming his innocence. So to us, such an approach may seem a little unreasonable, but it made perfect sense to people who used it. As I mentioned before, the investigative procedure in the pre-modern period was necessarily limited. And at the same time, the profound influence of religion on all aspects of life made possible the idea of turning to the supernatural world for true justice. It was thought that the ultimate power to adjudicate belonged to the omniscient God. But the ordeal was not without its critics within the church. So the main points of contention were that ordeals unduly tempted God and that clerics should not be involved in any proceedings that result in bloodshed, which ordeals often did, and clerics did administer them, as you can see on this picture. This all culminated at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, convened by Pope Innocent III. And one of the canons of the council prohibited clerical participation in ordeals. And by this point, papacy wielded enough institutional and political power to enforce this prohibition, and ordeals were abandoned quickly and almost universally. But the disappearance of the ordeal created a void in many European legal systems, which now lost the instrument to deal with difficult cases. So on the continent, this gap was filled by a new emphasis on confession, which was often obtained by torture, which played an important role in Inquisition trials. But in England, another solution emerged. So before the Fourth Lateran Council, English courts were using juries to indict suspects. A jury could publicly accuse someone of having committed a felony, and if this was confirmed by extra evidence or the person's excessive notoriety, they would then be made to undergo an ordeal. But once the ordeal was prohibited, English jurists were able to simply remove it from the equation entirely and make it so that the jury's decision as to guilt or innocence was not simply an accusation, but the final verdict. So all of this was happening after the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, which means that the new jury system traveled quickly across the Irish Sea. From the earliest surviving records of the common law courts in Ireland, which are from the end of the 13th century, we know that jury trials were a commonplace procedure in the territories of the Lordship of Ireland. But what about those areas of the island under the jurisdiction of Irish law? So it appears that Irish jurists also saw the value of the jury system and incorporated it into the established court procedure, which I outlined to you earlier. This is evident from a legal tract written around the year 1300 by Gillan and A.F. McFagan, one of the most well-respected legal scholars of his time. So Gillan and A.F. recommends jury trials specifically for the cases of homicide and theft. So if the defendant denies an accusation, that is, pleads not guilty, or if the eyewitness evidence cannot be obtained, the case is then handed over to a jury. So the text says, quote, "If the killing be denied, a common jury considers his case to clear or to incriminate, and if there be doubt, it goes to deny." End quote. So this is kind of an interesting combination of Irish and English elements. The jury is clearly a borrowing from the common law, introduced as a replacement for the ordeal, but it appears that the jury's decision was not always final, and if the vote was inconclusive, then the oath of denial, which I also discussed earlier, could still be resorted to if necessary. So hopefully this gives you a general idea of the legal process that dealt with homicide cases, but now I can finally tell you some interesting stories of murders and mysteries. At the start of this talk, I spent a while explaining what makes a murder mystery and why there are no true murder mysteries in medieval sources. So for this part, I went around and looked for stories, historical accounts, and court documents that have the most potential to be turned into mysteries with a bit of strategic concealment and disclosure on my part. So I will start with a handful of accounts from the Irish sources, and then I move on to a few cases of Irishmen tried in Anglo-Norman courts. And so I also would like to give special thanks to Dr. Nina Knockhard-Kiyu and Dr. Emmett Taylor at University College Cork, and to Dr. Shauna Horoward at Dias, who helped me find some of these fascinating stories. So the overall, the amount of legal material that survives from medieval Ireland is extremely impressive, but it consists almost entirely of legal tracts that describe how the law should work in theory, but we have little to no case law to illustrate how it was applied in practice. This is very unfortunate, but we can still find glimpses of interesting cases in other types of sources. One of them is narrative literature. So as you may have gathered from the example that I gave at the beginning of my talk, Irish sagas are full of deaths and murders, and some of them are pretty straightforward killings and can hardly pose a mystery, but others are a bit more ambiguous. So let's take, for our first case, Agel of Nashinor, the Colloquy of the Ancients. It is an enormous text originally composed around the year 1200, and it consists of individual but connected tales related by the Fenian warriors to St. Patrick about Ireland's past. So in one of those tales, Finn MacCool and his warrior band welcome 3 supernatural strangers into their ranks, accompanied by an equally supernatural dog. The 3 mysterious men offered to fight on Finn's side, and in return, all they asked was that no human came looking for them from dusk till dawn. But so in tales like this, a prohibition is always made to be broken, and so after a year or so, 2 members of Finn's warrior band couldn't fight their curiosity any longer, so they went looking for the 3 men, and when they found them, they saw that their dog, who in the daytime appeared huge and menacing, was now no larger than a pine marten, and from its mouth were flowing the fanciest drinks, which the 3 men were enjoying. But when they noticed the presence of the uninvited guests, they killed them on the spot. And then the dog turned around, and it breathed on their bodies so that they turned, quote, into dust and ashes, so that neither blood nor flesh nor bones of them were found there, end quote. So, although this tale is not meant to be a showcase of legal concepts, in this episode we can recognize a blatant case of secret murder and also evidence tampering. Concealment of the bodies in secret murder is taken here to a whole new level. The bodies are not simply hidden, but reduced to ash. Unfortunately, not much comes out of the investigation of this mystery in the story itself. A search party was sent to look for the 2 missing warriors, but there was nothing to find, of course. Finn seemingly started to suspect foul play, and he expressed his uneasiness to the three mysterious men. But here it's unclear whether the author of the text made the three men kind of feign ignorance on purpose to maybe imply their deviousness, or whether the storyline of the murders was just kind of silently dropped. So in the end, the truth doesn't prevail, and the three killers remain in Finn's company. In other words, it is a true literal murder mystery for the characters of the story, but not for the readers. Another example from literature that I want to show you contains a hint at proto-detective work. It's found in a text called The Violent Death of Dervigel, a 10th century tale from the Ulster side. The main heroine, Dervigel, arrives from the other world to meet Cuchulainn, with whom she is in love based on his great fame. But the two of them were not meant to be together, and so instead she marries Cuchulainn's fosterling Lugit. But then, due to some events that I will not be going into here, things intensified significantly, and Dervigel unwittingly provoked great rage and jealousy of the women of Ulster, who saw her as a threat to their own relationships with their men. And then suddenly, on a snowy winter day, Dervigel disappeared. The men of Ulster noticed her absence, but didn't know where she was. So that's when Cuchulainn observed something strange. There was disturbed snow near Dervigel's house. So he and Lugit, her husband, rushed to the house and tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. Lugit, Dervigel's husband, was suspecting the worst, so they called for her to open the door. But in response, they only heard her lament, a poem about her unhappy love. And when they finally managed to get inside the house, they saw a terrible scene. Her face was horrifically mutilated, with her eyes gouged out, and her nostrils, ears, and hair cut off. She died at that moment, maybe from her injuries or maybe from her sorrow. Upon seeing her, mortal grief struck Lugit as well, and only Cuchulainn was left, and he knew that it was the women of Ulster that did this to Dervigel. Enraged, he killed all of them who were in that territory. So this is probably the grimmest story that you'll hear from me today. The plot is very tragic and disturbing, but I wanted to include it because of the brief showcase of deductive work by Cuchulainn. It's not much. He only notices the snow and seemingly deduces that when the women brought Dervigel back to her house after assaulting her and so left many footsteps in the snow. But it's still an interesting detail that adds some dynamism and urgency to the story of Dervigel's discovery. Another source from murder mysteries, this time real-life ones, is the Irish Annals. These are year-by-year chronicles of notable and also usually pretty grim events, such as battles, deaths, and natural disasters. And most deaths recorded in the annals occur in battle, or often political figures are assassinated treacherously by their own allies. And a couple of high-profile murder cases can be found in the Annals of Connacht, which preserve detailed accounts of the events of the first half of the 13th century, when the Connacht kings were negotiating their position in post-invasion Ireland. So the murders that I will discuss here occur within the same political circle, so it's worth to introduce the key players. So in 1224, Cathal Crofter Conchobar, the long-reigning king of Connacht, died, having temporarily staved off the invasion of the province by the English. His son and heir, Aed MacCachal Crofter, was much less successful in these efforts. His short reign was fraught with internal conflicts, and even worse, the English magnates were ready to claim possession of Connacht's territories based on the charters that were issued by the English king. So eventually, Aed was forced to flee. He probably knew that an attempt at his life was imminent, and he even managed to avoid a couple of ambushes. So, for example, he suspected foul play when he was welcomed in Athlone by one William de Marisco and his men in 1227. The altercation resulted in William's capture. So for these reasons, it's a bit baffling that Aed's next move was to seek protection at the court of Geoffrey de Marisco, William's father. So before we find out what happened there, we need to meet another character, Hugh de Lacy the Younger. He was the son of Hugh de Lacy the Elder, the Lord of Meath, who was among the first English nobles to gain a foothold in Ireland. And this guy, Hugh de Lacy the Elder, angered some noble families in Meath by destroying churches and building castles in their place. This detail might become important later. But Hugh Jr. Had a career of his own, full of ups and downs and ever-changing alliances. He was an erstwhile supporter of Aide's father Cathal, but not for long. He was also made the first Earl of Ulster in 1205, but was soon exiled by King John. But after his return to Ireland, he briefly aligned himself with some Irish factions against the English crown, but again, not for long. And then he also held a charter for lands in Connacht, and he had ambitions to seize those territories. So you can see how tense these relationships were becoming. So let's deal with Aid MacCathal Crovdearg first. You could probably sense that his fate was sealed the moment he set foot in Geoffrey de Marisco's house. The circumstances of his death are both abundant and quite mysterious. So like Curroy, the monster hero of whom I told you at the beginning of the talk, Aid met his end while bathing. There is somewhat of a trope emerging here, with the main character being caught in a vulnerable moment. Aid was killed, quote, with one blow of a carpenter's axe while the carpenter's wife was bathing him. Here there is a reversal of Curroy's story. Instead of the jealous lover killing the husband, it is allegedly a jealous husband killing the lover. The theory that Aid's murder might have been a personal rather than a political act is presented by the analyst himself, who doesn't rule out the possibility that perhaps the carpenter struck him in jealousy, for there was not in Ireland a man of fairer mould or livelier courage than he, end quote. This is an unusually sentimental explanation of a major political event in a source that is otherwise quite pragmatic. But this was not the only theory. In the same breath, the analyst suggests another possibility, and you can probably guess the alleged culprits because I so subtly planted the clues in my brief sketch of the historical context. So, of course, we learned that, well, this deed of treachery was done on this righteous, excellent prince at the instigation of Hugh de Lacy's sons and of William, son of Geoffrey. This is hardly a surprising outcome, given that Aid held one of these people in captivity just a year prior, and the other had a direct interest in Connacht's downfall as a holder of land grants in the province. So this theory is more utilitarian and probably has a bit more truth to it. And it's unclear whether the nameless carpenter was a free agent motivated by jealousy or a pawn in a political intrigue. Regardless, he was apprehended and hanged the next day. In taking such swift measures, Geoffrey de Marisco was able to kind of save face in case he was even by any chance involved in this plot, but we don't really know. It is a mystery. So then, fast forward 15 years later, and now we are in 2043. This time death comes for the illustrious Hugh de Lacy himself, Hugh de Lacy the Younger, allegedly. Again, according to the Annals of Connacht, he is apparently found dead. He's found decapitated, actually, in a ditch at a castle construction site in Darrow in the province of Meath. But who would do such a thing? And more importantly, what business did Hugh de Lacy, the Earl of Ulster, have building a castle in Meath where he didn't have any lands? And then as well, wasn't Meath the domain of his father, who was confusingly also called Hugh de Lacy? So this is kind of a double mystery. Who killed Hugh de Lacy and which one? So the Annals of Connacht are a dead end, so we have to turn to some other sources. So sure enough, a record for the same year in the Annals of Lochkey tells us the following. Hugh de Lacy, Earl of Ulster, has died. This was not the first Hugh whom Gila gan Inacher killed at Darrow, but the last Hugh. So this confirms it. The Annals of Connacht contain a mistake. Hugh Jr. seems to have died a peaceful death in 1243, and it was his father, Hugh Sr., who got himself decapitated at some different occasion. We also learn the killer's name. It's Gila gan Inacher, but we still don't know who he was and why he did what he did. And for these final answers, we turn to the Annals of the Four Masters, and the record that we are looking for is under the year 1186. So it says, Hugh de Lacy, the profaner and destroyer of many churches, lord of the English of Meath, Breffne, and Argyll, after having finished the castle of Durrow, he set out accompanied by 3 Englishmen to view it. One of the men of Tethva, a youth named Gilla Ganinafer, or me, approached him and drawing out an axe, which he had kept concealed, he, with one blow of it, severed his head from his body, and both head and trunk fell into the ditch of the castle. This was in revenge for Colum killing. Gilligan in Arthur fled, and by his fleetness of foot, he made his escape from the English and Irish to the wood of Kilclare. He afterwards went to the Shinach and the O'Brien, at whose instigation he had killed the Earl. And so there we have it, the mystery is solved. The victim was not Hugh de Lacy the Younger, but his father, and his murder was arranged by 2 ruling families in Western Meath who were indignant at the Earl's destruction of churches, as I mentioned earlier. To do their dirty work, they employed a young man, probably a fosterling of one of the conspirators, who successfully fulfilled his mission. He then managed to escape undetected and was likely given protection by his patrons. So the confusion in the annals of Connacht is almost certainly an accident, but it kind of created a fun bait and switch of the 2 Hughs. So now, for our final batch of murder cases, we will turn to the records of the English common law courts in Ireland. These come in the form of plea rolls, where the details of legal proceedings were meticulously recorded. The records that I will be using for my examples today come specifically from the cases heard in the Court of the Justiciar, which was the representative in Ireland of the Court of the King of England. This court was held before the Chief Justiciar of Ireland, and at the time of our cases, this position was held by John Walden. These records are well known for the study of all sorts of crimes and misdemeanors, and they include detailed descriptions of many homicide cases. I kind of hesitate to describe them as colorful because these were real-life murders, so I don't want to make light of them. And another thing to consider with these records is the fact that most of them involve Anglo-Norman settlers, which is not immediately relevant for the task of trying to learn about the life of the Irish population in this period, but it's not rare to find cases involving Irish people, which is what we will be looking at. So the cases that I have selected for you are quite elaborate and will require some legwork to solve. But first, I wanted to look at a very short record of a hearing held in Cork on the 26th of July, 1295. So Dermot and Conor O'Croyley, charged with homicides and other misdeeds, put themselves on the country, guilty, hung, no chattels. So this is a pretty brutal outcome for the 2 Irishmen, and without any additional information about their alleged crimes, we cannot really say whether the jury's verdict was justified or not. But this gives me the opportunity to bring up another important point. If you remember, penalties in Irish law consisted predominantly of payments of varying amounts, so more serious offenses resulted in higher fines, and surely sometimes those fines would become exorbitant and maybe unbearable, but rarely was the wrongdoer in danger of losing his life for his offense. But under English law, murder led to the gallows and forfeiture to the crown of the felon's possessions, if he had any. This was aptly observed by the historian Gerard McNichol, who said, quote, "The English system would seem to have the virtue of simplicity, the Irish system perhaps of greater humanity," end quote. So records of this kind, as you can see on the slide, abound in the justiciary rolls, and their dry, matter-of-fact delivery makes them all the more poignant. But let's move on now to a different case with a somewhat happier resolution. You now have a taste of how direct and unmysterious these records really are, so I will once again take a few liberties and present the facts to you slightly out of order to create some intrigue. So here's the scene. On the 13th of October 1310, 13 jurors gathered at the Justiciar Court presided by John Vaughan in Dublin to hear the case of the Irishman Thomas O'Motho. He was accused of the murder of the Englishman Walter Robin, and Thomas was seized by the bailiff of Tala, Richard de Ballythermot. He basically arrested him one night when he witnessed Thomas fatally strike the victim with a sword. So then Richard's account of the events of that night might have been something like this. He was in Tala when he heard that there were thieves at a mill nearby, and the mill belonged to the Archbishop of Dublin. So he started making his way over to the mill to investigate, and he was accompanied by two of his men, Walter Robin and Thomas de Lech. On their way, they met a lone stranger carrying a lance and a sword. Suspicious, Richard asked the stranger his name. The stranger refused to answer and instead turned the question back at Richard. The exchange quickly became heated, and Richard's men tried to disarm the stranger, but he turned hostile and attacked Walter Robin with a sword, inflicting a mortal wound. So if this was the entire story, this could have been an easy conviction and gallows for Thomas, who comes off as the aggressor here. But from Thomas's perspective, the event went somewhat differently. That night, he was spending his time at a tavern in Tala, in town on business, maybe from Carlo, but we don't know. But the merriment was interrupted when a distraught man appeared at the door. It was the miller of a nearby mill. He said that he heard thieves at the mill, and he snuck out through a secret passage to get help in town. So the men who were at the tavern, Thomas among them, took their arms and went over to the mill with haste, but they found that the thieves have escaped, alerted by the noise of the crowd. So the men turned around and started making their way back to the tavern. Thomas was walking by himself a bit ahead of the group when he ran into three men heading in the direction of the mill. A man on horseback demanded to know his name, but Thomas was not in the mood to reply to strangers, so things escalated, and Thomas noticed that the leader of the group was making a motion with his lance, preparing for an attack. So Thomas got ready to retaliate, but he was immediately seized by the two other men who attempted to take away his weapons, and one of them struck Thomas's lance with his axe, and he broke the lance. By this point, Thomas had enough, so he unsheathed his sword and attacked the man who broke his spear. So in this version of events, Thomas's actions look much, well, let's say a bit more like self-defense, and the verdict becomes a bit more ambiguous. So this again is my creative retelling of the record in the plea rolls. I used the details provided in the document, but I attempted to separate the testimonies of the different parties from each other to demonstrate how different perspectives on the same event can change the way it's perceived by an impartial observer. And for a popular example of this, just think, of course, of Akira Kurosawa's classic film, Rashomon. But we are yet to find out the outcome of this case. Even with some of the evidence suggesting self-defense, Thomas had little hope to expect acquittal. He would have surely been hanged, but miraculously, an English nobleman, Mylor de Kendale, interceded for him and asked for his pardon, which was granted. This is quite an unusual turn of events, and some scholars have speculated that Thomas might have been de Kendale's servant. This rabbit hole goes even deeper because from other records we learned that de Kendale himself was the sheriff of Carlo, but he was by all accounts a very corrupt man, indicted for multiple felonies, including larceny, false imprisonment, and murder, yet somehow he seems to have escaped unscathed. But that's a story for another time. So one last case that I will discuss is by far the most complex. It's a real web of crime and corruption that can fill an entire evidence board. So I think, yeah, you can see my own attempt at untangling it on the screen. I won't be able to paint the full picture here, but I'll describe a few bits and pieces. So let's set the scene again. We now find ourselves in Kerry, and the hearings are taking place in the summer of 1295 in the towns of Tralee and Ardfert before the Deputy Justiciar Thomas Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald. It appears that the catalyst for this massive investigation was the murder of one William, son of Adam, son of Hugh, who may have been a resident of Limerick. At least he was killed in Limerick, and this took place on a bridge and was likely in view of several people. So the records are pretty confident in accusing Adam de Cantilupe and Richard, son of William de Cantilupe, of this murder. The likely motive was Adam's fear that the victim had a claim to some of Adam's lands. But the plot thickens when we find out that Adam de Cantilupe was not an ordinary man, but the deputy sheriff of Kerry and the brother of Richard de Cantilupe, not the same one as his accomplice, who was the sheriff himself. The two brothers also had a lot of relatives enmeshed in the story, about 17 of them, but none of them were as notorious as the brothers themselves. A little bit of digging unearthed an entire criminal empire run by them that involved murder, theft, dismemberment, extortion, bribery, forgery, meddling with jury selection, and pigs that eat children. So after carefully examining the records and taking lots of notes, I have counted at least 5 murders connected to the brothers in one way or another, with a potential 6th one. So one I have already discussed. Another one is the murder of Adam's own man, the Irishman John O'Hooligan. This time, Adam the Cantaloupe was not the killer. Instead, it was another Adam Francis. But Adam the deputy sheriff seems to have been uninterested in seeking a death penalty for the slayer, but he saw it as a way to make some money. He made the culprit pay a fine of 5 marks, which was a sizable sum, and he also extracted payment from all of the defendants' pledges or guarantors, as if the murder was a mere tort and not a felony. Then there was the murder of Richard Sabin, a merchant from Cork, for which both brothers were also indicted. Again, the killing itself was not done by them, but by a certain Myler McCorgany, evidently an Irishman. He was arrested and jailed in Limerick, but for reasons that the records don't disclose, Adam and Richard were determined to save this guy from the gallows. So the justices in Limerick were preparing to put him on trial, for which they needed a coroner's inquest. And this would have definitely meant bad news for the killer. So Adam took it upon himself to forge a letter from the coroner, written by himself, by which Myler was acquitted of that felony by deceiving the court. So the killer walked, and was later received by Richard the Cantaloupe, the sheriff, who was presumably interested in his unsavory services. For the 4th murder, we have very little information. We're only told that Richard himself, together with an accomplice by the name of Oisin O'Coggy, slew Richard the Hereford in the town of Ardfert. We also learned that Oisin was on Richard's retainer for 5 years, so it appears that Richard had a penchant for hiring murderers. And then the 5th and the potential 6th murder are closely tied. During Richard's tenure as a sheriff, a certain Thomas O'Brien, Irishman, was jailed for the death of Ralph the Cantaloupe, clearly a relative of the brothers. This made Richard really upset, and he ordered that Thomas be mutilated. The text says that his membra were cut off, by which we could understand either his limbs or his genitals. But either way, this was a flagrant violation of the procedure, and it was added to Richard's already long list of indictments. We don't know whether Thomas O'Brien survived this act of cruelty, which is why I counted him as a potential 6th death connected to the Cantaloupe crime family, as we may call it. So besides the murders, Adam and Richard also engaged in other abuses of power. So both brothers actively meddled with the appointment of jury panels, and Richard, the more powerful of the two, also harbored and employed multiple known thieves, including his own son Patrick. He was also not shy to act feloniously towards church officials. He allegedly stole from the chest of the Bishop of Emly, and he tried to bribe the Bishop of Ardfert to appoint his other brother, Thomas the Cantaloupe, to a clerical position. And when this plan failed, he ordered to kill a number of the bishop's men, who are described as faithful Irishmen, likely entirely innocent people. And finally, if you were curious, Richard was also indicted for allowing, quote, his pigs to eat a child, which was imputed to be his son, end quote. And although this was most likely a horrific accident, the most blameworthy part of this situation was that Richard refused to surrender the pigs to the coroner, as was required by the law. So under common law, any object or instrument that caused a person's death was automatically forfeited to the crown, but Richard disregarded this rule, presumably because he didn't want to part with any of his property. So in the end, what punishment awaited these two men who were so clearly corrupt to the core? Well, the English legal system, usually so merciless towards felons, malfunctioned on this occasion. The brothers managed to avoid corporal punishment and got away with paying fines, albeit very high ones. So it appears that in the end, the Irish custom of monetary penalty for offenses was thought to be advantageous in some cases, and it was used by the English courts selectively. So this is, I guess, where our journey through the seedy underbelly of medieval Ireland ends. And I thank you so much for listening, and I hope that I managed to educate and entertain you a little bit.